more broadly. And we got the infamous
Jose, something's happened to your sound. I don't think we can hear you.
All right, how's the sound now?
We can hear you.
All right, sorry about that, technical glitches, so need to adapt on the fly, and here we go again. So today you will learn about the residency
Okay, thank you and say any for organizing the one reason organizing part of it. Also technical research and position resident group and that we establish our resident toolkit and resident framework. These are the toolkit all resident and undergraduate on our residencies are covered. We'll have an explanation. So please say that you have any questions about the will answer questions about concerns at the end of the slide. So with that, next slide, and Michelle, over to you.
Thank you, Laura, for that discussion. And everyone, we thought we coupled this a little bit here to start about our target goals. In order to provide context for our work of diversity lines, presenting task force, and break. So we are a subgroup of the residency support break, which is up to current and former residents that work to support one another in our development and our interests through projects and mentorship. In that sense, RIG is a group of us that works with residents for residents. And so in the spring of 2019, the then convened got a call for participants who would explore questions related to the successes and challenges of residencies. In addition to the stories that residents shared formally in articles, publications, personal accounts shared informally among residents described a disparity of experiences. And it was felt that more guidance and structure was needed to improve resident experiences across the board. We felt that the Diversity Alliance's letter of commitment, which I will put in the chat now, I think that's the one. So the letter of commitment is, it outlines 5 commitments that the host institution when they join the Diversity Alliance, these are the commitments that they agreed to. So we felt that the letter of commitment was sort of too broad and left the host institutions with too wide a berth to interpret these commitments, which ultimately left the resident in a vulnerable position because no one is as greatly or negatively impacted by a failed or mediocre residency than the resident themselves. And so as these commitments are set by the Diversity Alliance, as residents, we did not feel empowered to make changes to these commitments. So we thus took it upon ourselves to develop the means and the tools to formalize residencies. So as you can see on the slide, our goal, our charge as the subgroup is to identify, critically examine, and assess current ACRL Diversity Alliance member residency programs to establish the efficacy of current programs and develop diversity resident best practices. And so our goals are to conduct environmental analysis, specifically targeting onboarding practices and procedures, to develop guidelines for assessing the preparedness of potential ACRL Diversity Alliance or residency host institutions, and to create best practices for onboarding residents. And with that, I will pass it to, I think we're going with Laura. Next slide, please.
It's me. Hello. So going about developing the toolkit, we met these goals through a couple of projects and activities. Landscape analysis is the first thing we did. It included a lit review and a review of ACRL Diversity Alliance commitments. We found that there was limited literature on residencies, and up until quite recently, there was a lack of general lack in documentation, best practices, or guidances and how to structure residencies, leaving them to the imaginations and capacities of the host institutions. This, combined with lack of a specificity of outcomes, assessments, and expectations set forth by the Diversity Alliance left the door open for broad interpretation, which we can attribute to the breadth of residency's experience. Through the landscape analysis, we had a number of takeaways, and now I'm going to pass this to Laura.
Thank you, Mallory. First, and perhaps surprisingly, residencies tend to center the institution rather than the resident. Residents are seen as a benefit to the institution, but not always or not primarily for the resident. And this can be seen in such things as the ACRL badge, the ACRL badge that the ACRL Diversity Alliance institutions receive for their membership. But there is a lack of accountability and assessment of the residencies programs with these host institutions. In the lack of the follow-up to see how residencies have been impacted, what their career trajectory has been like, or what their professional outlook has been. Also be seen in the very experience of, or the very existence of RIG, the Resident Interest Group, which is by residents for residents, and the very work of the subgroup to fill in the gaps within residency programs. And so secondly, and closely related, is that because institutions and the profession see residencies as addressing a pipeline issue rather than a retention issue or an advancement issue, there was an overemphasis on placement, but that same emphasis was not given to building the infrastructure to retain the resident, either by permanent placement or even making sure that the resident felt supported or welcome so that they would be encouraged and motivated to stay in the profession. And so to us, a successful residency from the viewpoint of an institution is that the resident lands a permanent position, while from the viewpoint of resident, success often translates to feeling supported, encouraged, and excited about what that they do. And the third, professional development opportunities were also not consistent. In fact, they were inconsistent, and in some cases weren't always encouraged or supported. And so with all this in mind, we published the Diversity Resident Toolkit in the summer of 2021. The toolkit takes what we found from the landscape analysis and combines recommendations into 4 tools designed to provide structure and support for residents from concept, which meaning before the resident steps foot on the campus, to implementation of the residency programs and beyond, so beyond post-residency. Next slide, please.
Okay, so I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about the resident-centered framework that we've been mentioning. So we've established that the ACRL Diversity Alliance benefits the institutions and not necessarily the resident. In principle, the Diversity Alliance asks members to make commitments to support residents. These commitments are things like committing to designing experiences to expand the residents' interests and skills. So an example of this would include mentorships or rotation through library units. Again, some libraries choose to implement a rotational unit structure where, for example, the resident spends 3 months in access services, and then they transfer to 3 months in tech services, and so on and so forth. But in practice, the literature review suggests that residents don't feel supported, and it's also based on our personal experiences as past residents, where we did not feel supported and have not fully received the benefits pledged to us. So as we mentioned, the toolkit was created with a resident-centered framework, which centers the resident's experience by recognizing that hierarchies and systems of power within academic institutions often marginalize residents' perspectives in the development of residencies, which can leave residents in a vulnerable and unsafe working environment. So with that said, there's 3 main principles to the RCF. The first principle is to center the resident's perspective and honor their experience. So with the example that I mentioned earlier about a rotational unit structure, something like that, the decision to rotate must originate from the residents' expressed interests and goals and not originate from the institutional goals. The second principle of the RCF is to uphold the resident as the primary audience and beneficiary. So the components of this toolkit, we'll get into it in more detail later, but especially the pre-residency checklist component are meant to prompt institutions to reflect more deeply on why they're doing a residency program in the first place. And it sort of is prompting us to ask questions like, can the institution realistically support a resident? And what are the shortcomings, and how can they be remedied? The last principle is committing to transparency. So if we're recognizing that the resident is the primary beneficiary of a residency program, and that the decision-making process is defined by the resident's needs, institutions must also be transparent about the processes themselves, and intentional about outcomes. Okay, so you can actually view the Diversity Residency Toolkit itself on the ACRL RIG website. So Michelle is gonna drop that in the chat. So the toolkit itself is licensed under an attribution non-commercial share-alike 4.0 international license. So that's a very long and fancy way of saying that anyone is allowed to distribute, remix, adapt, or build upon in any way this material for non-commercial purposes only, and so long as credit is given to us. If you choose to remix, adapt, build, do whatever you want with this material, you must license it under these identical terms. And as I mentioned, there's 4 main components of the toolkit. So the first one is guidelines for establishing residency planning and steering committees. The second component is pre-residency checklist for institutions. The third component is guidelines for establishing a mentorship program. And the last component is a residency support survey. So we're going to go through each of those 4 components in more detail, and I'm going to pass it over to Mallory to talk about committees.
So I'm going to go over the guidelines for establishing a residency planning and steering committee. So the purpose for establishing a residency planning committee and a residency steering committee is to provide structure and support for the resident from the initial planning stages through the end of the residency. The planning committee is a short-term committee that should set goals and evaluations and assessment for the program. The residency steering committee, on the other hand, is intended to be a continuous support system for the resident or the residency cohort that offers guidance throughout their residency timeline and experience. So the purpose of a residency planning committee is to develop the residency program, including a planning document, an overview, understanding, and utilization of the Diversity Residency Toolkit, working with the search committee to draft a position description and serve as a resource for the search committee. If the residency is rotational, the planning committee should define the purpose and scope of rotation. And if the residency is not rotational, the planning committee should define the purpose and scope for areas of growth. The planning committee is going to decide the membership of the residency steering committee. This is a chance to think critically about the purpose and role for each person on the steering committee. At least one member from the planning committee should be appointed to the search committee. The membership of the residency planning committee should be the residency coordinator, such as a dean or chancellor, a university provost, representatives from campus partners that are associated with DEI initiatives. The residency steering committee, on the other hand, is a committee that serves as a group of peers and library workers that the resident may go to for assistance and exist outside their reporting structure in case of issues during their placement. The steering committee can provide assistance with post-residency job searches and to help prepare for job interviews, such as mock interviews, help with CVs and cover letters. If there is a learning plan, then reviewing the learning plan or goals for the residents to ensure that the activities are appropriate to the residents' goals. The membership for this committee should include the residency coordinator, representatives from the library, including library workers, faculty, members of a library program. If one is there, this can be optional if the university doesn't have an LIS program, or a representative from the university or library that's related to DEI initiatives or relevant campus partners. No resident supervisor should be appointed to this committee. We understand that not every institution has the capacity to establish both committees or the workforce to establish both. Each committee has specific goals and purposes, and this subgroup deemed it necessary and important to make them distinct committees. In doing so, this emphasizes and incorporates key aspects of the resident-centered framework. Thank you. Next slide.
Okay, I'm going to be covering the pre-residency checklist for institutions component of the toolkit. We were really interested in developing a tool that would measure whether a host institution was prepared to host diversity residents, since that's such an important factor in resident success. So this tool is designed to be robust enough to account for many activities, tasks, and other support mechanisms that are important for hosting diversity residents, but also be flexible enough to account for different situations. It's not prescriptive in nature, but it's intended to provide an overall picture of a residency. So the checklist is divided into 6 sections, which I'm going to get into in the next slide, but the format is that a question is presented that should have a yes or no answer. So for example, has an organizational climate evaluation been conducted to assess and uncover staff and faculty attitudes towards diversity and inclusion? So if it's a yes, you just move on to the next question. But if it's a no, then the checklist asks for clarifying notes and plans for remediation, and then ultimately who is responsible for following up on those remediation plans. So the point of the checklist really is just to help institutions understand that there's a lot of pre-planning work that needs to go into residency programs. And it's not so much that every single checklist item needs to be a yes before you should host a resident, but the checklist should be used to show what areas of residency planning need more attention. And this helps the institution know where to sort of focus their efforts and to see if they're in a good position to host a residency program. And the checklist also helps center the resident experience over sort of big picture institutional DEI goals. Next slide. So as I said, we broke the checklist down to 6 categories, the first administrative actions, and this section covers administrative preparedness for both diversity initiatives more broadly, but also a diversity residency program specifically. The big picture questions are mostly about things like climate surveys and any organizational issues that a climate survey might reveal, as well as strategic plans. And the specific questions about residencies cover things like goals and objectives of implementing the program, the position, title, and if the job description is appropriate for an early career professional. The second section of the checklist is residency operations. And this section is really just to help ensure that the appropriate people are in place to help ensure the residency runs smoothly. So it includes things like having a residency steering committee, residency coordinator, a clear line of reporting for the resident on iterative assessment of the residency program, and then checking in on staff preparedness in placement or rotation departments. The third section of the checklist is institutional training, and that mostly deals with questions around DEI and cultural competency training. The section's mostly to check on how prepared supervisors, the steering committee, residency coordinator, et cetera, are in general, and if they're familiar with what microaggressions are, how to interrupt them, and then ways to navigate handling conflict that will come up. The fourth section is mentorship, which ties into the mentorship section of the toolkit in general. It includes questions around how mentors are selected, also covers an important distinction between resident mentors and mentors for permanent positions, which would be that mentorship for residents needs to include assistance with career planning and opportunities both inside and outside of the host institution. The fifth section is resident professional development and leadership training. So we actually suggested setting aside additional funds for residents beyond what's normally offered. And the reason for this is that residents are going to be quickly back on the job market due to being in a limited term position, and it'll help them be more competitive on the job market if they have more opportunities to network, learn, and fill out their CV. And we also wanted to make sure that who are involved in residency operations are helping identify opportunities for professional development and leadership for the resident, because that's really important for getting jobs after. And the last section of the checklist is the impact on resident and prospects of retention in the field. This section is really important, and it's a perspective that we felt was lacking from a lot of literature and resources we came across during our lit review. So the questions here really center the residents' experiences at the host institution beyond just training and things that could go on a CV. And they tie into that sort of retention aspect we keep talking about. So basically it's the question of, will the residency accomplish what it's supposed to do, or will it instead serve as some kind of anti-pipeline driving people out of the profession? So next slide, please. Since this section is really important, I wanted to include some of our example questions from it. So the first one is, are there any culture, climate, or staff and faculty issues that need to be addressed and planned for prior to the arrival of the resident? In the checklist, we provide 2 examples of this. So the first could be a coworker who's known racial or gender-based microaggressions and they're managed around rather than dealt with directly. The second is if a proposed placement is in a department with high turnover. So these are just 2 examples, but the institutions using the checklist should take time to consider other areas of concern that might be present in their institution. A second example is there a plan or procedures for how employees or patrons making racial or other microaggressions to the resident? This one's really important. It needs to be planned for because it is going to happen. So having a plan in place is really important and really contributes to that retention aspect. And then lastly, has there been any reflection and communication about what intentions or expectations, both implicit and explicit, the institution will be putting on the resident? So examples of intentions that would be harmful for a resident is treating the resident like a change agent for the institution or using the resident as a test subject for diversity initiatives. And the point of all of these questions is just to make sure that the institution and relevant stakeholders for residency programs try to pause and take time and reflect and center the resident. Inviting early career librarians into dysfunctional or harmful work environments or putting expectations on them to solve diversity issues in the fields isn't going to help solve BIPOC retention issues. Instead, that's really what contributes to these retention issues. So the overall goal of this component of the toolkit is just to encourage institutions to reflect on their preparedness to host a resident in a way that centers the resident's experience beyond just, do we have funds, office space, and staff to give them, work experience in libraries. Next slide, I think, Laura, you're next.
Thank you, Kalani. So the next section of the toolkit focuses on mentorship programs within institutions. Because of the inconsistencies that we found in support models across institutions, we created guidelines for the development of mentorship programs for residency positions. These guidelines could very clearly be used more broadly, but these are typically designed for residents, residency coordinators, and the residency steering committee or folks that are involved in the development, creation, implementation of residency programs. And again, the goal of these guidelines are to serve to develop and build on the residents' professional and interpersonal skills. The scope of the guideline is meant to inform the development or enhance your library's current mentorship program, but the actual creation of the mentorship program for the residency program was out of our scope and it's not included in this document. So again, this is just a guide. We know that each institution is different, and so, please take what works for you and, continue to build success for residency programs. And so the mentorship section is divided into 5 sections, include a suggested timeline for the mentorship program for residency coordinators, residency supervisors. It includes mentorship program guidelines for the residency coordinators and residency supervisors, mentorship program guidelines for the resident, mentorship program guidelines for mentors, and then also we've included a section for additional resources for mentorship and leadership development. And so again, these guidelines are designed to provide just a suggestion, considerations while you're establishing the residency program. But most importantly, it's designed to support the residency through that first year, year and a half of that onboarding process. If they're transitioning or rotating between different units, also designed to support that piece. And it does again focus on the structure of support and what is currently in place. And Anna will elaborate more on the mentorship program in the following slides. So next slide, please. And Anna, I'll pass it to you.
Hear me? Oh. Can you all hear me now? Okay, so thanks, Laura. So as she previously mentioned, this slide includes a screenshot of what you would see in the toolkit for the guidelines to establish a mentorship program. So the guidelines start with a suggested timeline. Then it moves on to program guidelines for residents, mentors, residency coordinators, or supervisors, and then it ends with some resources. So we broke up the first year of the residency mentor program into 0 months, then 4 to 9 months, and then in the first year. So on the left side of the slide, you can see the first section of the toolkit. So it has a suggested timeline that includes a list of best practices to implement in the first year of the residency. So on the right, you can see the structure of the checklist with a yes or no section in the middle, and then a note section on the right. So this checklist specifically for residency coordinators and supervisors offers a way to practice accountability and best practices, with the note section offering the opportunity to reflect on why or why not you have answered the question the way you did and what your institution is doing to address your answer. So next slide, please. I think we're moving ahead. There might have been, might have been another slide. Yes, the other one. That one. So on this slide, you can see what the guideline look for the residents on the left, and then the residency mentors on the right. So as you can see, they're meant to provide recommendations and again, center the resident, their experience, and provide accountability in the creation of a mentorship program that best suits the resident need, and that will benefit them both personally and professionally, and make it for a better experience. So you can see on the right that mentors are asked if they feel comfortable speaking with their mentee and if they have clear communication with the residency coordinator. So if you're find yourself hesitating on the yes, this might be a sign that you might not be fully ready to mentor or that your residency is not fully set up to support a resident's mentorship needs. So at a first glance, these questions might seem obvious, but it's important to remove the assumption that everyone knows how to be a mentor and everyone knows how to mentor a resident, and that they have a general understanding of best practices. So instead, we want to focus on mentors, coordinators, and supervisors, and the residents to think critically and really reflect on the mentorship program in place. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it back to Laura. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Next slide, please. And so the last section within the mentorship guidelines focuses on providing additional resources for continued support beyond mentorship models. So for example, embedding or developing a plan for leadership development was something that we found was missing across multiple institutions. So consider what your institution is doing to support career development. Could career coaching be a place or a model that your library may implement? What does support look like beyond your institution? So are residents being connected or coached, mentored through networking, for example? Are they being connected with other neighboring colleges or universities in the area, different types of libraries? Are they being paired with other residents across the nation? Again, as Anna said, removing that assumption phase and really moving beyond and taking those steps to create those networks, to create those lines that builds the pipeline into the profession. And again, this goes into the sponsorship model. So is a sponsorship model something that could take you beyond that first year and a half and really work to support the career coaching, the placement, the advancement within this field? And so finally, as you build your program or enhance and refine your mentorship model, one of the things that we found very helpful was considering what topics would you like your mentors, your coaches, your sponsors to make sure that they're hitting that align with the residents' goals, professional development, or long-term placement within the field. And so do they align with the residents' interests? What are the topics that that they're struggling with or that they want to learn more about? And really designing their support based on their interest, their experience, and their long-term needs. And so again, these guidelines are just suggestions for consideration when you're developing or refining your current program. And as you continue, again, focusing on that resident's experience and centering on their needs. And so now I will go ahead and pass it on to Maya and Willa, who will discuss the resident support system in the next slides.
Thank you, Laura. So we're going to switch gears and move on to the next component of the toolkit, which is the residency support survey. So during our literature review, we identified 4 important factors in a resident's experience. So this survey measures those 4 factors, which are mentorship, professional development, career advancement, and inclusion. And it measures it across 4 dimensions. So existence, agency, institutional support and funding, and the resident librarian's engagement and satisfaction. So we recommend that the resident take this survey at least 2 times during the residency, preferably like 3 to 6 months in, and then again, perhaps near the end of their residency. And while it's primarily designed for residents, it can also be taken by a supervisor or coordinator on behalf of the institution. If you choose to go this route and have a supervisor or coordinator take the survey, it's really meant to compare and contrast between the resident's experience and the perceived success or experience on behalf of the institution. So I'm going to pass it on to Willa, who's going to explain more about how to interpret the survey results.
Thank you, Maya. So as Maya mentioned, the literature indicates that the primary factors that create a supportive environment for resident librarians are mentorship, agency in selecting work experiences that support their career goals, professional development opportunities, and inclusion as a contributing member of the library's internal community. Therefore, these 4 factors make up the survey headings, which are mentorship, professional development, career advancement, and inclusion. And under each heading, there are questions targeting the 4 dimensions of whether these exist in the residency, the level of agency that the resident has, institutional support or funding, and the resident librarian's engagement or satisfaction with each of these areas. Some of the questions from the survey are highlighted on this slide. So this is in Excel, and the form is linked from the toolkit and it can be downloaded. Each question on the survey has a drop-down value that first delivers either a yes or no for the existence of the factor being examined. If the resident librarian selects no, that isn't present in the residency, 0 values are automatically populated for the remainder of the dimensions relating to that factor. If the resident librarian selects yes, that it does exist, a value of 5 automatically entered for the existence dimension, then the resident librarian goes on to provide a rating of 1 to 5 for each of the other dimensions. Next slide, please. So the results are displayed on a set of radar charts, and this sort of chart is really valuable for this type of exercise because there's an axis for each dimension and they're arranged radially around a central point and equally spaced. It's really good for a quick view of performance analysis. It can show which variable is doing best and see strengths and weaknesses at a glance across common characteristics. So this allows for a big picture look at how the residency is going from the respondent's perspective. So this result sheet contains 5 charts. The first chart displays all factors, so you can compare and contrast them. Then individual charts display a single factor in turn. So if a chart was completely blank, it would indicate that the factor is not present in the residency program. Whereas full diamond demonstrates that the resident is experiencing the highest level of satisfaction and support provided by the institution for that factor. The shape of each individual factor chart shows the skew or strength versus weakness of each of the dimensions of agency, institutional support or funding, engagement, and satisfaction with respect to the individual factor being measured. Next slide, please. So here's a closer look at the questions, responses, and results that I extrapolated on this slide for mentorship in particular. So if you look at the overall graph with the lines, diamonds in 4 different colors, you'll see that career advancement, the gray line, was the area where the respondent feels that the residency has completely fulfilled all dimensions being surveyed. Then professional development shown in orange and inclusion shown in yellow are also very robust. However, mentorship represented by the green and the blue diamond is one of the weaker results. It's the smallest diamond. So you can see that the respondent selected that it existed. So 5 points is automatically allotted. And you can see the point at the top of the filled radar graph goes all the way up to the top point of the 5th line. The respondent also got 5 rating for support, which is at the bottom. And as you can see, that point goes all the way down as well. However, agency was rated at 2 and engagement and satisfaction rated at 3. So for those dimensions, which are at the size of the diamond, you see that they don't go all the way out, 1 point to the 2nd line and 3rd line of the chart, respectively. So how can this be used? With the respondent's consent, for example, the steering committee, which does not include the resident's direct supervisor, can engage in some discussion with the resident and possibly the mentor to see how those areas might be strengthened. One example might be that the resident has an interest in a particular area, which the mentor doesn't have the experience in. but the steering committee might then be able to identify someone else who might be able to meet with the resident to foster or sponsor the resident's development in that particular area. So that's just an example. And I can give, from my personal experience, I did have a mentor in my institution, but I also had some other interests. So my supervisor at the time told me about the Library Publishing Coalition mentorship program. So I actually took part in that mentorship program, as well as one that was sponsored by the Society for Scholarly Publishing. And that was actually very valuable. I have mentors also outside of the institution to give feedback on how things are done in other institutions or how it might be done. Next slide, please. So the next step for us is beta testing the toolkit. So we are looking for institutions to take part in essentially field testing the toolkit. We received IRB approval for our study in September 2021. Shortly after we released the toolkit, and the research team comprises myself and Mallory, as well as Anna. So there's a reporting framework that we've developed, and it really just comprises the tools that form part of the toolkit. The pre-residency checklist, which incorporates questions about the establishment of the planning and steering committees, the mentoring checklist, and the residency support survey. And these will be submitted at intervals during the term of the residency. Then institutions and residents will also be asked to submit a reflective report shortly before the end of the residency. We encourage institutions to sign up, even if you don't feel you'll be able to complete all the steps or use the tools exactly as designed, because feedback from institutions who actually implement it will really be useful to refine the toolkit. We'll be collecting submissions by way of a Qualtrics form, which will also include the informed consent document for this study. Institutions and residents will submit separately and confidentially. In submitting their responses for this study, residents' responses should not be mediated through a supervisor, so those will be submitted separately. Of course, the institution and the resident are free to exchange the information on how they've completed these tools of their own volition outside of the beta testing. We also plan to organize a community call for institutions taking part in beta testing, one for residents and one for institutional representatives in the spring of 2023. So we are doing rolling enrollment for this study right through June, with the intention of institutions implementing this toolkit at the beginning of the 2022-2023 academic year. We will share our anonymized findings from this study, and we also plan to update the toolkit where warranted based on the findings. Next slide. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. We're really appreciative of the large number of people who turned out to hear more about this. And you see here, we have a contact email that you can contact the group directly. If you just have further questions that we might not be able to get to today, you can send us an email at the address in bold on this slide. And we've also shared our personal emails here.
So I think this might be our time for questions. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing.
I will